The 2025 Global CEA Census is now complete, and the final report offers deep analysis on data collected from more than 450 CEA growers and professionals around the globe. CEAg World co-produces the census with Agritecture, and for this three-part CEAg Talk series, I sat down with Agritecture CEO Henry Gordon Smith, lead agronomist David Caesar, and South American representative Victoria Mora. We've chosen three topics that stood out to us among the findings, and our discussion will shine a light on what that data tells us. Here in part one, we're talking about the role of low and mid-tech greenhouses in the industry's success. All three parts of this series will be available at ceagworld.com/ceag-talks. Go to ceagworld.com/census to download the entire 2025 Global CEA Census Report. All right. Thank you all for being here. It's always great to talk to you guys. And there is so much in the census. Victoria, we were just talking about that, how there is, the more you read it, the more you look at it, the more really interesting little insights you can pick out to start to think about. So I'm excited to delve into that with you guys here today. Our first topic is going to focus on greenhouses. The census highlights a significant share of low and mid-tech greenhouse operations in the global CEA landscape. How important are these simpler production models to an economically sustainable CEA industry?
Yeah, I found this data really interesting. And I think it's important that many people understand some of the context for CEA, right? We know globally that most CEA operations, most greenhouses are low and mid-tech. So in some ways, it's not that surprising. I think it's also important to understand, just because we try to set the context for this data, that we had partners. This whole census involves us reaching out to the community and saying, tell us what's going on with you. And in this case, we had partners in certain regions like Almeria, Spain, where there are lower and mid-tech greenhouses that collaborated with us to share this with other growers to increase the volume of that. So I think it was great that we got more of that data that's representative of most greenhouses in the world, and also shows that there's communities that sort of have particular data and interest that can contribute to this discussion. So a little bit further on that, I think that low and mid-tech greenhouses, they can be deployed easier in some respects. They can be managed easier if you have a low cost of labor, in many cases, and access to labor. So it makes sense why they're being used. What I think is really interesting to also take from this data for a lot of our audience that may be more on the high-tech side or the supplier side is that there are significant challenges that these greenhouses face, and they can benefit from certain interventions with technology, as, for example, sensors get cheaper, or as some software solutions that can help manage inventory or market conditions can help them be better, or even some of the hardware as they start to face shifts in their climate conditions. And this is exactly the case in Almeria, Spain, that I see on the ground when I visit some of these greenhouse growers and what the data is telling us here.
I want to complement that we also looked at some of the economic aspects in the census. And so when we look at unit economics and when you look at the main costs in CA, you look at CapEx, initial investment, but also OpEx. And one of the unit economics that investors are looking at is kilowatts hour per kilograms produced. And so in low-tech greenhouses, you also have a lower technology integration, which means that your cost per electricity will be lower. However, that also has trade-offs, as Henry mentioned. And so you might also need a little bit more of labor, which was also indicated in the census as one of the highest costs, right? But then the different levels and positions that you need for professionals working can also be different, because the more technology you need, the more professionals that work with technology you need that can have a higher salary compared to lower tech greenhouses, where sometimes the farmers don't need to have a technical knowledge as high and their salary can be a little bit lower. And then I also would like to add to this a little bit about context, right? So in regions where you have favorable climate or low labor costs or supportive government policies, you may also have a more favorable ecosystem to prefer some of these low-tech technologies. And an example is Brazil. So in my part of my role at Agritecture is also a South American representative. And I looked a lot at Brazil. And in Brazil, the transition to CA is most likely not going to be driven by novelty, because in terms of technology, you have a favorable climate, you have labor that is relatively cheap, although there's also some gap in that, because talking with more professionals in the international landscape, I saw that there is a vision that labor in Brazil and South America in general is cheap. However, specifically in the context of Brazil, policies are making, and regulations related to labor laws are making some of those requisites to have an employer. They are leveling up the standards, which are also making it a little bit more expensive for those farms to hire. And this is also another reason why technology is being integrated. But going back to the context of Brazil, high-tech systems, they also would require sensors and components that would further drive CapEx and maintenance up. And a lot of this tech often has to be imported. So this makes it even more expensive, right? And so if you introduce complex systems in a region like that, where there's also a shortage of skilled technical labor, you can also create a burden for the business. And so we do see right now low and mid-tech greenhouses, like in the case of Spain, being very big for Almeria, but also in countries that have this context, like Brazil, also adopting these technologies that are more low and mid-tech.
And I think AI will be something that's going to help improve this industry. One example I can give is if you think of a low-tech or medium-tech greenhouse, they may have been collecting some amount of data, but may not have the ability to pay for a data analyst, right? But now AI is your data analyst, right? And it's extremely low cost. So I think, if a greenhouse is not collecting data, AI is not going to help. But if they're collecting data, they have essentially a free data analyst that they can use to help improve, aspects of their agronomic production.
Most CEA is low tech in the world, number one. Number two, choosing the right CEA, right, really depends on where you are and the labor and energy conditions, right? And if we think globally, it makes sense why most are low tech based on those conditions, right? And then, so if we think about emerging markets, what's really interesting there is you've got demographic shifts. This is the third point. You've got demographic shifts that as they get wealthier, as labor prices change, as skills are more required by certain groups or whatever it is, our energy prices shift, or water gets scarcer, right? These conditions change it. So the markets are going to evolve, where some are going to go from low to mid-tech, and in some cases, high-tech is going to make more sense and start to add up. That's part of us adapting to a changing climate and changing demographic conditions. And I guess the last point relates to a little bit what David said, which I think is so interesting about AI and low-tech, right? As we look to the future, the lines between low tech, mid tech, and high tech can blur. Like, why can't you have a low tech greenhouse with a sophisticated AI inventory system and operating systems, right? There's obviously more data points we get from high tech, but AI and these tools are advancing and adapting in ways that hybrid approaches between them. So again, I think that's why, design and context, these are things that really matter and drive success across this market.
Okay, great. Yeah. So we will always, there's always going to be a range. There's always going to be, because of the way the world is laid out. Yes.
And there should be a range, right? Because there is no one size fits all. And that is, there's no panacea for this. And that's part of why vertical farming has gotten into so much trouble, is because when you claim that and you invest in and you push that, you actually create a false narrative and you end up stuck with the wrong solutions or over-engineered solutions. So, I think it's important to encourage the diversity that we see in the census and the lessons we can learn from that to say, hey, let's take a step back and let's start to think about how we can maybe blur the lines a little bit to design for each context while still keeping some things, standard that we can all benefit from. That's the balance.
Yeah. And in certain areas, certain markets, certain areas of the world, it would be foolish to invest in a high-tech greenhouse because you're spending unnecessarily because you don't, like, the market is not going to be able to support that, right? And so essentially, yeah, having low and mid-tech greenhouses is essential to being able to survive, for sure.